Welcome back to the Cardano Virtual Summit 2020 and the session Cryptocurrencies, Prospects for Mainstream Adoption. We are extremely fortunate in this session in that we'll be in discussion with a very special guest, none other than the former Prime Minister of the country of Georgia, Mamuka Bakhtadze, who was Prime Minister from 2018 to 2019. And Mamuka Bakhtadze's legacy, more than anything, is that he in some ways drove forward some incredible reforms in Georgia, ensuring that Georgia became a hub for innovation and inward investment from technology companies from overseas. And he also ensured that blockchain technology was mainstreamed in government services, particularly with the migration of land registry data onto blockchain. Mamuka Bakhtadze, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rod, for these nice words, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me on this very informative online session. Thank you.
Well, let's jump straight into it. Let's educate people who may not know much about Georgia and the attitude it takes toward technology and blockchain in particular. What are current Georgian government attitudes toward blockchain technology?
Well, in order to answer this question, so let's go back to the initial idea when we start creating the new strategic development framework for Georgia, and basically the major idea behind this strategic framework was to make Georgia a multidimensional hub, and with a particular focus on high tech and on technologies in general. And as you know, Georgia is known for the low taxes, and Georgia is always doing great in all major international rankings, in doing business ranking, in all other major international rankings. So year after year, our sovereign ranking was improving, but however, all of us had this feeling that we had to do more in order to make Georgia also as a hub for technologies. And basically, this was my belief and belief of my friends that the next big thing, of course, in the global economy will be the blockchain and its endless opportunities. Georgia became the first country in the world that introduced the blockchain technology in the public services. So particularly it was within our national agency for public registry that incorporated blockchain to increase security, accessibility, and openness. So it was a pilot project, and we had some amazing results with it. And actually now the agency is working on the second phase of implementation, which will be most related to the trust contracts. So we had a successful pilot project, and after that we made a decision to use this experience in other fields as well. And I do hope that soon we will have the similar successful cases in other sectors like education, agriculture, and many others.
And I wanted to ask you about your own personal attitude to blockchain during your time as Prime Minister, but I think you've largely answered that question. But when you had the first and ongoing second phases of blockchain adoption, what were some of the successes, even if they were very, very small successes that made a difference to a very small number of people? What kind of problems were solved through the adoption of blockchain technology in Georgia?
Well, if we'll take this as a particular example, I mean, the land registry process, of course, it had really extraordinary positive results, because we were facing the same problems like I think many other nations, when people have no old document or paperwork to prove their ownership on the particular pieces of land, and many others. So, but what is most important, I think that it also gave us the possibility to have more efficient policy-making process for our agriculture needs. Still, big number of citizens in Georgia are involved in agriculture sector. So by introducing blockchain in the public registry, so we actually created also the very good information field for the government also to be more efficient in policy making when it comes to agriculture. So when I'm talking about the endless possibilities of blockchain technology, I see a lot of synergy effect. So when you are implementing in one particular industry the blockchain technology, it also gives you the possibility to use the data for other industries as well, and therefore be more efficient in policy making. So basically, I mean, this pilot project was really, really extraordinary success for us and for everybody who was involved in it.
I explained in my introduction that one of your key achievements was turning Georgia into an innovation hub. What tactics and regulatory changes did you make in order to attract that inward investment and relocation by tech companies?
Well, as I have mentioned, our vision is to make Georgia a multidimensional hub with a particular emphasis on technology. So we had a number of discussions with the tech companies who are doing business on a global level, and so we gathered all this information. So we did a precise analysis. So what we can do to make the environment in Georgia for the tech companies even better. And of course, firstly, we started with taxes. So we introduced the new legal framework according to which for the tech companies, the tax is almost zero in Georgia if they will conduct research and development activities in Georgia, sell their services and products to other countries from Georgia, which was very appealing for the tech companies. But of course, what is the most important, I think, is to have the ongoing process of the human capital development in the country, because these companies, all of them need talented people. Yes. So, and the biggest reform which we initiated, which I believe is the bravest step that we made since our independence, was, of course, introducing the education sector reform. So I do hope we will have more time to speak about it. And basically, the tech companies, they saw that the tax regime is very positive. At the same time, the country will be investing big and serious amounts of money into the human capital development process. This means that we will have the access to the talented people in Georgia. So I think that the combination of these two factors was the most important. But at the same time, of course, the adoption rate by the state agencies itself, the adoption rate of blockchain technologies, yes. And so we started with the National Agency of Public Registry. So now we are doing it in our education sector. So I think that is a third pillar, that the state agencies are also part of this process. And I think it's really a win-win situation for everybody, because the state agencies are actually getting a lot of information from the private companies, and at the same time, the private companies are getting amazing experience, which will help them to make their products and services more and more efficient.
Great. The way you're speaking, it sounds as if you're actually on a journey. You say that Georgia was the very, very first country to incorporate blockchain into government services. You're now in the midst of another phase of blockchain integration with some projects you're involved in the education sector. Is this just the start? Are you on a journey? Are you going to do more?
of course, it will be more because sky is the limit. But just not to forget a very important piece of information. In 2019, Georgia was named as #2 country in the Global Innovation Index, which was a great success for us because we were doing very good in all other major rankings, but also we wanted to show that a small country can also be so successful in the Global Innovation Index. Well, when it comes to the education sector reform, it's a very emotional topic for me because it was a major reason and major motivation for me to enter into politics, because I and my friends, we believe that we could make the transformation of Georgia only via education sector reform. And the major idea behind this philosophy was when we initiated a new legislation according to which any government will have an obligation to invest at least 6% of GDP, which is 25% of our budget, into education, into human capital development process. And of course, I mean, there was a lot of criticism about it because Georgia is still facing the economic challenges, and there were questions like, I mean, are you sure that Georgian budget can afford itself to spend 25% on education? And what was my answer? Yes, that. And I would be the happiest person if we could have a chance to invest even more. Yes, 8% of GDP to education. But what is the most important about this education? That this is very much related to the concept also of making Georgia a technological hub, because we cannot be successful in our aspirations unless the tech companies will be sure that Georgia will be able to provide the talented people, and that have guarantees that state will continue to invest significant amounts of money into human capital development process. And this reform is particularly linked to the blockchain technology. The input-output is doing a great project within the Ministry of Education. They are working specifically on a qualification verification project, and as we speak to transform our country via education, this project had its paramount importance. So, therefore, I think that now, as the education sector reform is becoming a flagship project for Georgia, also the visibility of the possibilities of blockchain technologies also will become more and more visible. So this is the reason why I say that for the blockchain, sky is the limit in Georgia.
Fantastic, thanks for that. I want to ask you a few questions specifically about cryptocurrencies. What do you think the prospects are for very broad adoption of cryptocurrencies, and where will we end up? Do you see the near future, the next 5 to 10 year time horizon, being one where we have cryptocurrencies and traditional or fiat currencies coexisting side by side, or do you think there'll be a fairly rapid adoption of digital currencies by the majority of countries? Where do you think we're going?
Well, I think that the COVID pandemic once again showed that it is an inevitable process. And everybody knows that I'm a big advocate of the digital currencies. And moreover, I think that the nations who would like to be successful in the 21st century will ultimately come to this idea that they would have to introduce the digital currencies. But of course, there are a lot of question marks that should be answered. I also understand the opinion from the regulators, yes, because it's a very sensitive topic. But if you look at the bigger picture, what is my opinion, that it is an inevitable process. We know that China is very active in this respect, and it's not a surprise for us, because in the last few years they were pretty active in this direction. But I believe that that's an inevitable process, and I also believe that the countries who will adopt it at an earlier stage, they will have a significant competitive advantage in the future. But once again, let me repeat myself. But of course, there are serious question marks which should be answered. But at the same time, I do hope also to see that the politicians are more open-minded when it comes to the digital currencies. And I think that the COVID pandemic once again showed that we, as a global community, we should be more active in adopting the idea of the digital currencies.
Great. I want to turn to an issue that seems to really polarize opinion within technology and business communities, within government circles, and certainly within the blockchain industry. And that is that there was an announcement during your time, last summer, during your time as Prime Minister, the last time I was in Georgia, of Facebook's Libra project. Where do you stand, and what do you think it represents? Some say it's a fairly blatant attempt to jump on the blockchain bandwagon. Others say it's a potentially good thing because it will drive adoption and encourage people, will legitimize the idea of blockchain and digital currencies. Where do you stand?
I think that we should give a credit to Facebook for initiating this ambitious idea. And the reason why I say so is that it is very important to educate and also increase the awareness of the blockchain technology, especially of the endless possibilities that it can give to the communities. And so from this perspective, I think that the Libra project could have become a very solid platform to increase the awareness about the possibilities that blockchain can give to the communities. And I think that we should give some credit to Facebook for launching that idea. But you know that it has been delayed, and I have heard a lot of criticism as well as support to this particular project. But if you will look to this project from the perspective that I tried to show to you, I mean, from perspective whether it will help us or not to increase the awareness of blockchain technologies for the worldwide community, I think that it could have been a very good and solid platform to achieve this goal. Still, I think that the knowledge of the blockchain technologies, the capabilities and opportunities that it can give to people is not so well known globally. And so any platform that can play this role to educate people what the blockchain technology is about, what kind of advantages it can give to any particular person is very important.
You've given us some great insights into Georgia's journey in recent years. The fact that on the World Bank's Global Innovation Index, Georgia was down at, I think, 112 not too long ago, and rose right the way up to 6th in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, ahead of countries like the UK. The fact that Georgia last year managed to get up as high as 2nd in the Global Innovation Index. An incredible journey. What advice would you give to politicians and governments elsewhere as far as blockchain technology is concerned?
Well, what would be my advice is that all of us, we should be more open-minded when it comes to the blockchain technology. The fourth industrial revolution is already underway, and on the top of that, COVID pandemic has accelerated the need for drastic changes. I love history, and I think that history teaches us the best lessons. And one of the lessons from the first industrial revolution was that the countries that missed the opportunities of the first industrial revolution were struggling for decades to close the economic gap between them and the countries who were early adopters of the technologies that were part of the first industrial revolution. And moreover, I think that, and I see a lot of similarities. The first industrial revolution was powered by steam engine, yes, and I think that the fourth industrial revolution actually is powered by blockchain technology. So we cannot afford ourselves to miss this opportunity, and all of us, we should be more open-minded when it comes to the adoption of the blockchain technologies. But at the same time, we who believe and who are supporters of the blockchain technologies, we also should be more active in educating the global society about the opportunities and advantages of the blockchain technology.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. You've given us a really fascinating insight into your time in government, the reforms that you were able to push and implement during your time as Prime Minister, and also a fascinating insight into where Georgia is going next as far as blockchain technology is concerned. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Mamuka Bakhtadze, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for this wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you. Former Georgian Prime Minister Mamuka Bakhtadze has given us an incredible insight into his role and the role that the Georgian government has played in mainstreaming blockchain technology into government services and what they think the shape of the future will be. However, governmental policy is only one part of the equation as far as broad-based mainstream adoption of blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies are concerned. There's also a place for regulators and regulation. While governments and politicians come and go, regulating bodies like the United States Securities and Exchange Commission are pretty much permanent features with very, very different remits to politicians. The Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, has a very clear remit to ensure fair and efficient markets and to protect investors. We're very, very lucky today to be joined by the former Commissioner of the US Securities and Exchange Commission to discuss exactly these issues and the prospects for mainstream adoption. Paul Atkins.
Well, thank you, Rod. It's great to be here with you today. Thank you.
We're really, really privileged and pleased you've been able to join us here at the Cardano Virtual Summit. We'll go straight into the questions, Paul. And let's come straight to the point. What are current US governmental attitudes to blockchain?
Well, I think they vary all over the place because we have not just the federal government in our system, but we have 50 states and then territories and that sort of thing. So it's safe to say that there are a lot of different attitudes, and it also depends. So within a governmental structure, like at the federal government level, it depends on the agency. And so, for example, ones that are more focused on potential criminality have one particular point of view. Others might be more focused on market issues or entrepreneurship. And then the same with respect to the 50 states. ago, from it's just like around the world, you have a lot of different attitudes. So, and those are also evolving as time goes on. So as people learn, as situations change, we have, this epidemic, worldwide epidemic and whatnot. So all of these things come into play. So what might pertain today might not pertain tomorrow or 2 years from now.
Sure. And moving away from governmental attitudes, I think lots of people would know, particularly given your experience as former commissioner of the SEC, what's your personal attitude towards blockchain technology now?
Well, I've always been one to support entrepreneurship and innovation, and to have government get out of the way of people who are trying to come up with market-oriented solutions to various problems. So unless you have a real market failure, the government basically should stay out of the situation and then allow human ingenuity to come up with solutions. And so I was commissioner at the SEC from 2002 until 2008, and in the incredible feat of market timing, I left the SEC 6 weeks before Lehman unfortunately went under. And of course, there were a lot of rumblings and problems leading up to that. And then after that, I was on a group called the Congressional Oversight Panel for the Troubled Asset Relief program, TARP. And so I was involved in a lot of the issues that came about after the financial crisis itself. So anyway, so out of that very sad period, which had a lot of dislocations, of course, that's when this whole idea of blockchain and Bitcoin and started to come about through the white paper, the famous white paper, and everything else. And when people heard that back then, they poo-pooed it, if they had even heard it. A lot of people did. Other folks saw, a real promise to it. And so here we are now, 10 or so years later, and so Bitcoin has, of course, spawned lots of other types of cryptocurrencies out there, and all sorts of ideas of people trying to think of ways, use cases to make the blockchain work, not just in finance, but in other things. So I think it's a very exciting time. You have even governments now buying into the idea. And so I think in the next 5 and 10 years, we'll see even more dramatic changes as things to build up.
You say that people are rapidly developing various use cases for blockchain. Is that the route to adoption?
Well, I think so, because a lot of people still view Bitcoin a bit as a plaything. And sure, there are uses in commerce, potentially, that hasn't actually picked up so much yet, but just because of the infrastructure issues and things like that inherent to Bitcoin. But of course, other people are trying to come up with other solutions for the payments issues and things like that. So all that's very exciting, and maybe will live up to be an international type of infrastructure that will actually take root and make international commerce much more efficient and less prone to problems that might come up because of the inherent openness of the blockchain and the distributed ledger concept. So that part, I think, is very exciting and has a lot of potential in commerce, but we're seeing even more in other areas. And I mentioned the current epidemic that we have. And if you look at how necessity is the mother of innovation, and so you never know what's going to come out of problems like this, and how people in the medical area, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, whatever, the whole supply chain, whether it be masks or whatever else that we have a shortage of, isopropyl alcohol, or toilet paper, that we've seen, on an international scale. So those sorts of things, I can see how in the future, blockchain will be able to help and may be able to prevent shortages, because the whole essence of a market economy versus a central planned economy is how do you pick up on all of the signals coming from the billions of buyers and potential buyers and their demands. How does that send signals out to the suppliers and manufacturers, distributors, and all of that to get the right product to the right place at the right time? And so I think the use cases that are inherent in an idea like blockchain, I think, are pretty exciting. And so I think we haven't begun to even explore all of those particular solutions yet.
Okay. And moving more specifically to cryptocurrencies themselves, what do you think the future holds? Do you think we're moving slowly or perhaps even quickly toward a situation where traditional fiat currencies and cryptocurrencies will coexist? Do you think that potentially we'll have a situation where that becomes the norm, or that possibly digital forms of currency will themselves completely overtake traditional fiat currency?
Well, we'll see. That's the big question, and on that hinges, the value of Bitcoin and everything else, right? So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. I think in reality they do coexist already, because you have between Ether, Bitcoin, and other crypto assets, you also have other private things that are being developed, especially on the payment side, and so that, and then you have other electronic payments platforms like Venmo or whatever, and then in China, WeChat, how that has taken off over there. So China itself is pretty much already basically a cashless society, and how that is changing. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this advances, but it's going to really depend on the acceptance of these particular instruments or currencies by people in real life. So, from the corner drugstore to the big box store to, something like on eBay, if you're ordering something from one country and trying to get it from the next, PayPal's trying to fill that particular situation now, but you still have inefficiencies of currency translation and all of that. So that's the promise of a truly international type of cryptocurrency, and that would be developed independently of governments, and for the libertarian's dream, I guess we be able to say that. So I think it's going to come down to acceptance by individuals and overall, and how well those particular assets and the infrastructure around those assets can meet the needs of people in a frictionless, as seamlessly and frictionlessly as possible, and without a lot of worry about valuation fluctuations, which is, of course, an issue for the merchant who's selling you something and worried about what it might be worth the next minute after you walk out of the store. So all of those things, obviously, are big issues that have to be worked out. And then you have the issue of governments as they, kind of eye these, potential central bank digital currencies, which I think is pretty much of a fiat currency, obviously, basically. But depending on the country and the regime and whether or not it's demanded that be legal tender and nothing else, I think will have a big effect. And then basically how possible it would be to get around those sorts of rules and interdictions that might be imposed on electronic transfer and the internet and that sort of thing. So that's very much of a future issue, but we're rapidly approaching that sort of decision point for, and it's not necessarily for authorities, but it's also for real people. So whether or not they give up their gold and go to something else, it'll be interesting to see.
You say that the success of cryptocurrencies relies on adoption by ordinary people, either organically or potentially through compulsion, through legislation, as we're likely to see in some jurisdictions. What's your view of Facebook's Libra project? Is it possible that could be a Trojan horse that really introduces mass adoption and legitimizes the idea of cryptocurrencies?
Could be. I mean, of course, that's what I think. Not that I've talked to them, but I think that's what the folks at Facebook probably were hoping for as far as rolling out this idea. They have so many users of their platform through all sorts of countries, and especially in countries that don't have strong currencies and that have suffered from huge inflation and manipulation by kleptocratic regime, that rules over the people. So that's I think that's a good a potential, obviously, use case for what Facebook proposed. But the way I guess they will probably even admit themselves that the rollout could have been better as they did it, and they could have kind of prepared people better. It's funny. I had heard that in China, that Chinese government people were thinking that this is a plot by the U.S. government to get hegemony of the United States dollar everywhere and to undermine what's going on in China. Whereas here in the United States, from our government's perspective, at least some people in the government, the similar view was, but kind of flip, like, oh my gosh, this is a way of undermining the U.S. dollar and its position in the world, with respect to commerce, because it does play a very important role for international trade. So those sorts of things, are helped to, I think, derail at least the Libra initiative, at the beginning. And so, to their credit, the people at Facebook have kind of refigured and rethought their approach, and are still apparently in the process of evolving a way of maybe pursuing this particular goal in a different way. And so, may 1,000 flowers bloom or whatever, as far as and let the best type of product win at the end of the day that gets good traction, good adherence, and people who put it to use and better their lives. Because obviously, if it doesn't better their lives, they're not going to really be willing to use it. And if it doesn't make things easier, less costly, and that sort of thing. So, so a lot of answers have to be, have to come forth with respect to the questions that are being posed about whether it be Libra or whatever they want to call it in the future, and other sorts of crypto assets.
Okay. Given your experience and expertise, it would be wrong not to ask you about the state of Wyoming and your view on the extensive pro-blockchain regulation and legislation that's been passed in that state. So what's your view on what's the experiment that we've seen in recent years in Wyoming? And do you think there's potential for that to be replicated in other states?
Well, so that's a great example of, in the United States, our federal system of government, because this is an international audience that we have here today, but we have a federal government that's governed by a constitution, and so we have 50 states that are sovereign states, making up the United States. And so they have delegated, what's not delegated to the federal government is left to the states and the people to figure out. And so the states have wide latitude over lots of things to figure out. And so this is an example of one of our state governments taking a step forward and seeing an opportunity. Wyoming is out in the Rocky Mountains, out in the western part of the United States. It's a fairly large state territory-wise, but as far as population goes, it's not one of the most populous states. So here they have a good sense of individuality out there, and so they've approached this particular statute in that sort of spirit of individualism and to encourage entrepreneurship. So they've come up with an extensive framework with respect to crypto assets and blockchain. And we have a speaker here at this conference, Caitlin Long, who's has already or is about to speak on it. But she was involved apparently with the drafting and passage of the statute. So I think the various aspects of that, recognizing direct property rights of holders of crypto assets, and that would be upheld by Wyoming courts. Coming up with a sandbox, for where people can experiment and without real fear of getting thrown into jail or whatever, within parameters there. And then we're even going so far as to approaching the whole question of depository institutions, financial institutions that would be able to service these cryptocurrencies. And then a very important question of providing custodianship, which is what institutional investors really need to have to be able to fulfill their fiduciary duties to their investors. So all of this is a very, I think a well thought out framework that they've put together in Wyoming. And we have a lot of examples of that over history in the United States of how the state governments are great incubators of new ideas. And here again, just like in the real world where you have competition between people and how the competition helps to, develop ideas and improve things, because bad ideas will not really get any traction and fall off the wayside, and good ideas will get adherence and then investors and that sort of thing. So the same thing with respect to regulatory frameworks and as far as like where corporations in the United States decide to have their situs, where they become have their registration. And so Delaware is one of the major states in the United States for that. So here, Wyoming could well become, a state where that attracts these sorts of companies. So, I wish them well. I hope that we'll see how, as people experiment with going to Wyoming and setting up their business and falling under their particular statute, how that takes off. Now, of course, the one thing about the internet is that it's global, and so you have to be aware, even though you fit under one particular rubric, you have to comply with other sorts of frameworks that are out there wherever you're doing business or wherever your customers or investors might be. So that's the other issue. But it's great that people are taking steps forward, that they're thinking innovatively, coming up with new ideas, and then that helps put pressure on other more reticent jurisdictions to answer that, because they have their own citizenry, they have their voters who want to know, well, why can't I do what my neighbor across the state line is able to do? And so that also over time does have a good effect.
Sure. Moving into the international arena, what's your view on China's rumored plans for a central bank digital currency, and also your view on central bank digital currencies in general?
Well, the People's Bank of China has recently even test run their digital yuan here recently. So that's looks to be up and running, and they have the advantage of being a centralized state to be able to impose whatever they decide to do on their people. Other countries are not set up that way. So we'll see, what comes of that. Obviously, they were driven a bit, apparently, by the announcement of Libra and what they were perceiving to be a threat against their currency. And then maybe they will have other ulterior motives as well with respect to their foreign policy and, how they are, overseeing their native population. So who knows, how that all goes. But when you have a central bank, I mean, this is basically a fiat currency just, being done in a digital format rather than, with banknotes or, electronic wire transfers. But still, it's the same aspect where the supply and demand of the currency is controlled by ultimately politicians who decide, how the monetary policy is to be pursued. So, maybe it's easier to do commerce that way with, that sort of digital currency, and maybe it's better for international wire transfers or not wire transfers, but just transfers through that, through the mechanism there of, the internet. But whether that makes such a big difference overall to normal people and to commerce and to get, part of, like I mentioned before, as far as the ultimate rationale behind Bitcoin was more of almost a libertarian type of aspect of getting currency out of the control over from central governments, sort of like a digital version of gold or something else, which of course gold can be manipulated as well. But I think that was the dream of the people who thought of about Bitcoin at the beginning. And so, where all that stands with a central bank type of run digital currency is completely different. So I think we'll see how people accept it or not, where they have the freedom to accept it or not. But anyway, but it's always susceptible, I would think, to the political whims of the people who are running either the central bank or the central government that is in charge of the currency.
Okay. And it sounds as if you're essentially ambivalent about central bank digital currencies. Is that a fair comment?
Well, there may be, it may be more efficient. There may be efficiencies run out of that, and maybe it may be more efficient for the central bank then to look after money supply, because that's the one thing that, like in the United States, that the Federal Reserve has complained over the years that it doesn't have the way it used to back in the good old days, where they were able to, quote unquote, good old days. Not that I think they were that good, but in that respect, but where they were able to control the interest rates and the money supply much more than they can now. But so maybe that's one offshoot of a central bank currency. I haven't studied it enough to say that or not. But I think to me it's just an extension of a fiat currency, and it's not really anything that drastically new from what's being done in the past, except for perhaps the efficiencies and that sort of thing from it.
Right. Well, Paul, you've walked us through your opinions and shared your insights right the way from state level through to federal government and regulatory level in the US, right the way through to the international arena. I really want to thank you for joining us here at the Cardano Virtual Summit. It's been a real privilege. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you very much for having me.